So this really worked out. I'm just going to keep rolling on it. I'll let him do a sideboard. 2 out of 3 is rough. I'll be honest. It's a whole nother ballgame. I don't win very many. They're pretty good on the sideboard, on knowing what to do. That's where I lose. We try though.
Saphire and Other Posthumous Papers by Christopher Blayre. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Book. I happened to be in our registrar's room one day, and quite unconsciously I produced an effect. I had some letters in my hand, and when I had finished with Blayre, I referred casually to one of them. I said, "Do you know anything of a man called Max Carlyon?" He sprang to his feet and almost shouted, "Do I? What do you know about him? Ask Amboyne. Where is he?" To this singular confused address I had no direct answer to make. What I said was, "I don't know anything about him. Preserve your capillary decoration against the time when age shall commit indiscretions regarding your bumps. There is a letter from him. He appears to have dropped very unexpectedly into a baronetcy and some books. Whatever may be his views about the baronetcy, it is clear that he does not care a hang about the books. He wants to sell them so as to repair his house, which would appear to be moldy. That's all. Now, you tell me about him." The registrar had seated himself and looked rather ashamed of his demonstration. He said rather warily, "Oh, nothing in particular, but what a small place the world is. Amboyne and I came across Max Carlyon years ago, under very painful and unpleasant circumstances. Fancy him a baronet. I thought he must have died of alcoholic poisoning by now. I hope he hasn't got any children." "Sir," said I, "you interest and excite me. Shall I ask him to call? You might gather up the threads of what appears to have been a very pleasant acquaintance." "Don't play the fool. It isn't a matter to laugh about. What are you going to do about it?" "Well, I shall put the matter before the council, and then, I hope, I shall go and see the books. He says there are hundreds of volumes of early medicine and science, especially occult science. It sounds like a very interesting lot. Whatever you do, don't have him here. I couldn't stand the sight of him." Thus the registrar, uneasily. To pass over the preliminary and intermediate stages, I went in due course to Clough Ive, in the north of Ireland, where I met the new baronet. I have never learned what were his relations with our registrar and the Regius Professor of Medicine, but I agreed with every word they had not said. He was an appalling beast. Fortunately for me, after the days of my arrival, I saw no more of him. The house was empty, save for the books, and was in rack and ruin. Sir Max Carlyon left next morning for an unknown destination, and I put up at the village inn, which was unpretentious and comfortable. Still more fortunately for me, I found that the pastor of the parish was an old college friend, Fergus McDermott, of whom I had lost sight for years. I spent my evenings with him, and he told me, in sections, the amazing story which I am going to write down. The library, which was kept partially clean by an old Irishman and his wife who lived in the lodge, was a bookman's paradise. The books were wonderful. I found the Edition Principe of all the rarest works of 16th and 17th century science and medicine. But what made my inspection lengthy and tedious was the remarkable fact that, though they were all in contemporary bindings, they were all lettered on the backs as theological works, lives of the saints, commentaries, biblical exegesis, and the like, and every volume had to be taken down and examined separately. It puzzled me extremely until I heard the story from McDermott. I asked him if he knew anything about the beast. "Divil a word," he replied. "I don't want to. but his great-uncle married my great-aunt. You know, of course I didn't. My father and grandfather were parsons here before me. That's how it is I'm here." Mac did not appear to be much impressed by the advantages of his hereditary cure of souls, but he had a friendly parish, an efficient stable, and an excellent cellar. "You know," said he, of course I didn't, "this man is an unexpected arrival from heaven knows where. He wasn't on speaking terms with any of the family. That's why he has only got the place strictly on the king. The Carline title seems never to pass directly from father to son. It spurts about like a firework cracker. You never know whom it will hit next. By the way, you ought to spend the night in that library." "Not for the wealth of the Indies." "Don't interrupt. In that library on the 13th of August. You'd see the family ghost, and with luck might have your brains bashed out." "Thanks, no. But tell me about it." And he told me. The following is the gist of it, extracted from Mac under the influence of much tobacco and the generous wine of the country. I seldom had to interrupt him, excepting for the verification of genealogical details, which in his discourse had a tendency to become confused. Way back in the early 19th century, the then Sir Willoughby Carline died without male heirs, and it was ascertained that his brother, Carlton, had died in Rio de Janeiro years before, leaving a son, Errol, who was a briefless barrister in London, and than whom no one was more surprised at his unexpected accession to the title and estate. His father had never addressed speech or letter to his elder brother since. As a lad, he had betaken himself to Brazil. But even if he had remained in England, it is probable that the surviving Carline would have been equally isolated from the rest of his family. This condition of affairs requires some explanation, and the explanation is as follows. When His Majesty King James I instituted the perpetuity of knighthood by conferring the new title of baronet upon such gentlemen as were willing to aid him in his Irish reforms, one of the first to assume the dignity of the new order was Mr. Carline of Clough-Ivey. The Carlines of Clough-Ivey were said to be the oldest, proudest, and wealthiest of the Catholic families in the north of Ireland. That they were old and proud and wealthy, there is no doubt, but whether they were entitled to the superlative is a question upon which Milesian genealogists have been divided. Anyhow, the Carlines, who succeeded one another, had one fetish which was embodied in the emblazonment of the family escutcheon, to wit, on a field argent a crucifix proper, supported dexter and sinister by a hand jewels bearing a sword, with the motto, "To the faith faithful." From this it may be gathered that the Carlines were Catholic to the backbone, and every tradition of the family was in some way connected with, or the outcome of, their devotion to the Church. Two of the Carlines had been cardinals, and the family tree positively bristled with priors, monsignors, and bishops of the Holy See. More than once the family had been threatened with extinction by the celibacy of these holy men, and had the baronetcy been conferred upon Mr. Carline of Clough-Ivey in fee-tail, it would have become extinct in the third generation. As it was, the succession was unhampered, and fell from generation to generation upon the nearest living male heir of the late baronet. It was thus that one morning Errol Carline woke in his chambers in Lincoln's Inn to find himself entitled to the Red Hand of Ulster upon his armorial bearings, and what was of more importance to a briefless barrister, to the house and estate of Clough-Ivey. It was a complete surprise to him, for, from the day he was born in Rio de Janeiro, he had never held any communication with, and had never seen, his uncle, Sir Willoughby, and for this, to them, all sufficient reason. His father, whilst a lad at Oxford, had fallen in love with a Protestant maiden, the daughter of the dean of his college, and had announced to his brother his intention of marrying the lady. The elder brother had promptly, with the traditional bigotry of the Carlines, informed his younger brother that, should he disgrace the family by union with the heretic woman, he would be disowned on the spot by all other members of the family. And moreover, he was warned that the lady would never be recognized by them or by the church as his wife. Deeply wounded and boiling with fury, young Carlion formally cut himself adrift from his brother, who in turn ruled a crimson line through his name on the pedigree that was preserved at Clayton. Married to his sweet heretic, and in due course father of a baby boy, the image of his mother, it is hardly surprising that Carlion embraced the Protestant faith, and young Errol was duly baptized a Protestant, in defiance of a last strenuous effort on the part of his uncle and sundry ecclesiastical collaterals to save his young soul from inevitable hellfire. The breach had been complete, and Errol Carlion had grown to a man's estate, and had been called to the bar, conscious indeed of the fact that he was the nephew of Sir Willoughby Carlion of Clayton, but beyond that knowing nothing of his family, save in the remembrance of his mother, who had died when he was a child, and of his father, who had followed her some 10 years later to the grave. One warm spring afternoon, therefore, in the year of grace 18 blank, Sir Errol Carlion arrived a stranger, and in the eyes of his tenantry, a heretic, at Clayton, the first avowed Protestant Carlion who had trodden the ancestral halls. I say the first avowed Protestant, for there dwelt in the memory of Sir Errol a story that had been told him, years ago by his father, of a great-granduncle Spencer, who had been regarded by the family as having heretical tendencies, and as having in some mysterious way come to a bad end in consequence. So far as he could gather, the details of the story were as follows. Sir Spencer Carlion had been a student. He lived at Clayton a solitary life, unbroken by any companionships, save that of his chaplain-confessor, a young priest, distantly connected with the family and noted in the Roman Catholic Church, despite his youth, for his exemplary piety and fanatic austerity. It was not without an object that His Eminence, Cardinal Willoughby Carlion, principal of the Benedictine confraternity at Monte Cassino, had appointed Monsignor Whiston to the chaplaincy of Clayton. Rumors had reached him in Rome to the effect that the devotion of Sir Spencer Carlion to the interests of his church left much to be desired, and he hoped that the propinquity and example of Monsignor Whiston would effectually check the tendency that, according to rumor, Sir Spencer betrayed to dabble in the occult sciences, medieval magic, and other studies forbidden to her children by the Church of Rome. It was even whispered that he had leanings towards the doctrines of Luther and Calvin. Accordingly, the young priest had been installed at Clayton as the custodian of Sir Spencer's orthodoxy, and 2 years later the winter sun shone in upon a ghastly scene in the library. The first servant to enter in the morning was greeted by the spectacle of his master sitting in his accustomed chair, his head lying on the table before him, his brains beaten out. A window behind him was wide open. The shrubs outside were torn and trampled. Beneath the casement a blood-bespattered paperweight was found, which had evidently been the instrument of Sir Spencer's murder. And from that day Monsignor Whiston had never been seen or heard of. Sir Spencer having died a bachelor, the baronetcy descended to his younger brother Carleton, who consequently relinquished his purpose of entering the church. Of all his ancestors, the heretic Sir Spencer was the one whose history interested most deeply the young Sir Errol on his accession to the title. That his great-granduncle had been murdered in a fit of fanatic frenzy by his chaplain he never for one moment doubted. He deeply regretted that he had never been able to discover, indirectly or otherwise, the nature of the studies that had been brought to a close by his ancestor's death. That he had been engrossed in study at the moment of his murder, there seemed no doubt, but whatever had been the books or papers that had cumbered the desk at which the corpse was found, either they had been taken away with him by the murderer, or had been destroyed. The library consisted almost entirely of theological works, and no folio, quarto, octavo, duodecimo, or pamphlet on the shelves seemed in any way to savor of the forbidden studies which had led to his ancestors' destruction. Often, late at night, whilst Sir Errol sat in the same chair at the same desk, immersed in his literary work, he would lean back, lost in thought on this subject, his eyes fastened upon the darkness before him, which his single working lamp was powerless to pierce. It was on one of these occasions, a few months after his arrival at Clayton, that he was made the victim of a terrifying and wholly inexplicable incident. Quite suddenly, without the slightest shadow of warning, he was seized with a sensation of deathly sickness and apprehension. He was overwhelmed with a conviction that something stood behind his chair, but, paralyzed with terror, he seemed unable to move. At last, by a strong effort of will, he turned in his chair, and as he did so, it seemed to him that he caught a momentary glimpse of a tall figure, robed in the black cassock of a Benedictine monk, standing behind his chair. The face of the apparition was deathly white. The eyes, like flaming jet, stood out against its pallor. The right arm was raised above its head in a menacing gesture. That was all he could catch as the figure faded into the shadows of the heavily curtained window behind his desk. To put it mildly, he was severely shaken up, and turning back to the desk, he became aware of a spot of pale light in a far corner of the library. As he watched it, fascinated and frankly terrified, it moved and appeared to wander up and down the bookcases and along the shelves. He pulled himself together with a violent effort and advanced towards the wandering light. He reached it. There, within a few feet of him, suspended in the air and sharply outlined against the surrounding gloom, was the specter of a human hand, bearing a taper. The taper was alight, but the whole hand and the taper seemed to be of themselves luminous as they wandered from shelf to shelf, as when one searches for a volume in the dark. His brain reeled. It was dawn when he found himself awaking from unconsciousness in one of the deep chairs of the library and crept away to bed. Sir Errol Carlyon was 28, sound in mind and limb, and of exemplary habits of life. The idea of his being frightened by a ghost was preposterous to his daylight senses, yet the impression of the preceding night had been too startlingly vivid for him to pass it by without a further thought. Naturally, his mind reverted to the fate of the heretic Sir Spencer, and on the following afternoon he sought the chapel of Clayton and found the tablet commemorative of Sir Spencer's death. It read simply, "Sacred to the memory of Spencer Willoughby Carlyon, 7th Baronet, who departed this life on the 13th August, 1787, R.I.P." He started as he read. It was now the 14th August. The preceding night had been the anniversary of his great-granduncle's murder. That night, and on many nights after, he watched in the library for the reappearance of the apparition and of the searching hand. In vain. No supernatural happening disturbed his work, and as days formed weeks and weeks grew into months, the incident became blurred amid later impressions. More completely was it obliterated by the fact that Sir Errol was on the eve of taking to himself a wife, the daughter of the Protestant rector of the neighboring village. "My grandaunt," commented Mac as he paused to refill his pipe and eke his glass. "That was the foundation of the Protestant succession at Clayton." After a moment or two, Mac went on. They were married on the 15th of August that year. On the 13th, Carlyon was sitting, reading in the library, not thinking at all about the ghost, as you may suppose, when suddenly he felt creeping over him the same sensation that had terrified him a year ago. The date flashed into his mind, and in an instant the whole thing came back to him, and he sprang from his chair, turning as he did so. There, as in the year gone by, stood the apparition, the spectral form of a Romish priest, whose coal-black eyes seemed to burn into his own. Mastering himself with a supreme effort, he sprang forward as the spectre raised his arm. Then he saw that the hand held one of the square leaden paperweights that our forefathers were accustomed to use. As he sprang into the space occupied by the apparition, a sensation of icy coldness and faintness gripped his whole body. In another second he had recovered from the shock, and he was alone. Quickly he turned towards the point where he had seen the hand on the former occasion. There it was, wandering from shelf to shelf. He came close and watched it as it roamed over the bookcases. The books that became visible in turn as the luminosity of the severed hand reached them were all of the most orthodox kind. Carlyon noted some of the titles lettered on the backs. There were the Rationale Divinorum Officiorum of Gulielmus Durandus, printed at Venice in 1559, Ducange's Glossarium, the complete works of the Abbé Fleury, in the edition of 1739, the life of the Arch-Romanist Julien de la Rovere, Pope Julius I, who paved the way for Leo X, the Amsterdam 1755 edition of the Testament of Richelieu. All these details he noted as the ghostly taper passed the volumes, and then suddenly, even as he looked, a great folio edition of the Commentaries of Origen disappeared before his eyes. As the volume vanished, the hand holding the taper also disappeared, and Sir Errol, bathed in cold perspiration, was left in absolute darkness in the corner of the library. He had watched too long to be content to abandon his investigation there. He returned to his former place, and, bringing his chair and the lamp into the corner, he deposited the latter upon a stool and seated himself to watch the empty space in the shelf whence the Origin had been wrapped by an unseen hand. For an hour he kept his eyes fastened upon the gap, and then, hypnotized by the fixity of his gaze and worn out by the reaction of his nerves, he fell fast asleep. When he awoke, it was broad day. The lamp had gone out, and the Origin was back in its place. With a stifled exclamation, he drew it from the shelves and carried it to the table. There he opened it. It was Origin only as to its outer cover. Enclosed in the binding that might once have contained the early Christian commentary was the Perea Naturalia of Albertus Magnus, the cornerstone of medieval magic. This must have been the work in which Sir Spencer Carlyon had been engrossed, when the blow, treacherously delivered from behind, had hurried his unshriven soul into the presence of his Maker. Feverishly he turned its leaves to find whether any papers or notes were concealed within. About halfway through, 2 leaves were stuck together. Cautiously he began to separate them. They adhered to one another with a clotted, sticky brown substance, now dried and hardened by the lapse of time. Sir Errol started back. This had been the page at which his ancestors' studies had been brought to a termination. His brains and blood served the purpose of a ghastly bookmarker to identify the place. Shuddering, the master of Clayton restored the volume, the silent witness of Sir Spencer's murder, to its place in the dark corner of the library, and stood there wrapped in thought. "Well," concluded Mac, "he married my great-aunt the following day, and my father says she wondered for years why he seemed so grave and grey on that important occasion. But he never told her of his vigil in the library. Until the day of her death, she never knew why. At nightfall on the 13th of August in every year, the library was locked up by her husband, who kept the key himself until he reopened it on the morning of the 14th. We bought the books. I did not think it essential to point out in my report that the majority of them would require to have the backs re-lettered. There was an awful row over the expense of this." Note: reading over this record after the lapse of many years, I think it proper to add here that Sir Max Carlyon died some years after the sale of the library at Clayton, childless, and as there appeared to be no living representative of the family, the property, in a shameful condition of decay, is sheeted to the Crown. C.B. End of section 7. Section 8 of The Purple Sapphire and Other Posthumous Papers by Christopher Blayre. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Cosmic Dust. Many years ago, Mr. Kipling related a remarkable incident in the lives of certain journalists who had what is known in the newspaper world as a scoop. They were present at the capture of a sea serpent, and having written an account of the capture, each according to his lights and personal idiosyncrasies, they agreed that the story was too overwhelming for publication, and by common consent suppressed their narrations and wrote nothing at all. I have found myself in the same position, but I am impelled, after a considerable lapse of time, to set down the following account of the matter. It may be that the time will arrive when what I have to say may be rescued from the scattered archives of dead records and brought to life as an anticipation, like Roger Bacon's and Leonardo da Vinci's adumbration and invention of the aeroplane. There are those still living and at work who will remember the account given by the professor of psychology, not the present occupant of the chair, but his predecessor, Chalmers, of the death of Aloret Marquand, and of his commerce with Alila, which account may see the light contemporaneously with that upon which I am now embarking. It will be remembered that he recorded, without laying any particular stress upon the matter, that on the spot where he caught his momentary glimpse of Alila, there was a circle of scintillating dust, a small quantity of which he collected and preserved in a tube, which he carried away in his pocket. The scientific instinct which led him to preserve this specimen was the cause of his death, a horrible death. A short time after the incidents which he related, much in the spirit of the present record, he found himself to be suffering from a painful blister on the right breast. As it refused to yield to ordinary treatment, and enlarging, became deeper and more malignant, in point of fact a rodent ulcer, he confided the trouble to his friend, the Regius Professor of Medicine. The Regius Professor took a very grave view of the matter. "Are you sure," said he, "that you have not been exposed to the direct action of radium?" "Not that I am aware of," replied the patient. "Why?" "Because if I know anything about it, this took its origin in a radium burn." My late colleague knew enough to realize the gravity of this pronouncement. "Then this flaky, corn-like granulation of the sore and of the skin round it, you think maybe—" and he hesitated. "Yes, I am afraid so," replied the professor of medicine. The early history of the discovery of radium is punctuated with the names of its victims, martyrs to science who, in the dawn of knowledge of this terrible element, and before the methods of protection and their vital necessity were understood, paid with their lives for the knowledge which they gave to the scientific world. Visitors to the gruesome galleries of the Museum of the Royal College of Surgeons in London have been appalled by the exhibits illustrating the progress and results of that unconquerable scourge, exfoliative dermatitis, the gradual and irresistible flaking away of the tissues which precedes a lingering and irresistible death. The professor of psychology was a brave man, but the verdict of the Regius Professor was one to make the bravest man on earth quail. It was sentence of death. It was not till some weeks afterwards, when the disease had reached its maximum force, that my colleague suddenly remembered the tube of scintillating dust which he had tucked into his upper right-hand waistcoat pocket, and had carried there until his return to town, when he transferred it with other relics of Marquand to the case containing his private journal and papers. It was then that I came into the story, for he sent the tube to me with a request that I should give him my views on the contents. It was only recently that I had been appointed professor of chemistry in the University of Cosmopoli, and to tell the truth, I had not yet quite settled into the position and got my bearings, either among my colleagues or with the students, and I confess to a feeling of satisfaction which I experienced when this ordinary collector's tube was brought to me by the Regius Professor of Medicine with my dying colleague's message, to which he added his own earnest instance. He brought it to me wrapped in a piece of lead foil out of a tea chest, late in the short afternoon of a dull December day. After his short explanation of the circumstances, he made no allusion to the death of Professor Marquand. We took the tube into the dark room of the laboratory, and there unwrapped it. The display of scintillations was staggering. Imagine a super spinthariscope. I hastily wrapped up the tube again and placed it in the safe where our microscopic store of bromide and radium was kept, and we returned to my study. "How long," said I, "has this deadly thing been in existence, and where has it been kept?" "Chalmers has had it for months in a writing case, which he has kept in an iron safe in his cellar, but for 2 days he carried it about, naked, in his waistcoat pocket." "Good God. And Chalmers?" "He is doomed. Rodent ulcer and exfoliative dermatitis." And thus it came about that the chemical laboratory of the University of Cosmopoli possesses the largest and purest specimen of the element radium in the world. Whether the dust, which consisted of quite 50% of pure radium, was shed upon the floor of Mark I's observatory in a scintillating circle from the draperies of Alila, or whether it arrived independently of her during many weeks by radiation pressure, remains an open question. We shall return to this later on. Let me attempt, at least, to marshal the facts as they unfolded themselves in the months that followed. Though, like the journalist to whom I referred at the commencement of this record, I can never, nor can the colleagues who took part in their unfolding, publish them. All I can do is to transcribe them from my laboratory notebooks, and leave them for the information of later research workers. After we had, with infinite care and taking every possible, every known, and some new, precautions against radium burns, separated out the pure elements, we had left remaining about 3 cubic centimeters of a pale gray dust. I divided this into 4 parts, one of which I confided to the professor of botany, one to the professor of zoology, one I retained for myself, and the 4th remains as it reached me, in the cabinet of the chemical laboratory. My successors, if they think fit, may repeat our observations. It resisted all known methods of chemical analysis. All that I could show was that it was largely organic. That is to say, I proved by negative methods that it contained no inorganic element, excepting perhaps a trace of iron and of the mineral olivine. The work of my colleagues, however, was rewarded by results that even now I feel a considerable hesitancy in setting down. The professors of botany and of zoology conducted their researches together and concurrently. The methods they employed are familiar in the textbooks, and to these were added some blind and empirical processes of which, no doubt, they have preserved records.
Take a 5-minute break on that. Hold on. Salvador Daily, huh? It's a pretty good deck. Light and dark, you know, yin and yang here. Very well put together. I just kind of... We wing it, you know what I mean? We're low here, so I don't know. I don't know what to say to you. Truly. Abstract. An abstract book. It kind of is. If I were to just read that, Without me? Figure out how that goes.
It is only the results with which I am at this moment concerned. It was after the lapse of some 6 months that I was sent for to the botanical laboratory, where I found my 2 colleagues in a state as nearly approaching excitement as is permitted to a university professor. The dust had yielded no results under ordinary conditions of atmosphere and temperature, and the final cultivation had been made in slightly saline water at a temperature of 100 degrees centigrade, in fact, boiling point. They laid great stress upon this. May one ask why? I said. They looked at one another, and then one of them, I forget which, laughed nervously and said, "That would appear to be the temperature on this planet within a very few years of the consolidation of its crust, the consistenture status." I was startled. The reply seemed to open up illimitable fields of conjecture. I stammered. "But the Cambrian period, Azoic rocks?" "Why Azoic?" replied the professor of zoology. "But you are thinking of the Archaean series, Precambrian. With the earliest sedimentary rocks, we get life without question, perhaps before." "My good man," said the professor of botany, watching for my recovery, "we're going to show you some things so entirely inexplicable that the mind flies at once to the only possible explanation, which is an impossible." "That is rather confusing," I suggested. "Yes, confusion worse confounded, beyond the dreams of Milton. In this pressure chamber you see the culture of your dust actively proceeding. Here are some mounted microscope slides. In balsam you have protozoa, algae, mosses, bacteria. In dry cells you have microscopic shells, baby lamellibranches." "And they came?" I was almost afraid to ask. "From the material you submitted to us." "Then you think—" "We don't think. We dare not think. Here is a tiny thing. We dare not give it a name, but we know it." They showed me their preparations. To the botanist I said, "What are they?" He replied,
"Hey, sir.
These things do not inhabit the earth today, excepting in that boiling tank." To the zoologist I said, "What are they?" He replied, "These things do not inhabit the earth today, unless represented by one little bivalve shell, excepting in that boiling tank." My brain reeled. "What are you going to do next?" The professor of zoology replied, "We are going to call in the professor of geology and paleontology." We made an appointment with him for the following day. My esteemed colleague, the professor of geology, was one of the most remarkable men of his time, or of any other. He presented to the astonished student of human nature the almost unheard-of combination of a distinguished man of science and a prig. In the earlier days of his career, it had been confidently asserted by cosmogonists on the metaphysical side that in the beginning the Almighty created the professor of geology, that, having rested a while after this stupendous effort, he set about the creation of a world which might, in some respects at least, be a place worthy to be the habitation of the professor of geology. The latter, it may be said at once, was far from convinced that the second effort of the Almighty had been altogether a success. He inspired a wholesome fear and respect, not unmingled with dislike. He duly attended the conference in the botanical laboratory, explaining that the utmost limit of time he could spare was 20 minutes. He remained 2 hours, at the end of which he was visibly annoyed. For the first time in his professional life, he was unable to annihilate his colleagues with a few disagreeably worded ex-cathedral sentences of doom. "I may assume," said he, "that you are not seeking to make me the victim of some futile practical joke. But if you are, I am free to confess that the means you have adopted to that end are utterly beyond me. You tell me that these organisms have been cultivated, bred, from a few cubic centimeters of dust, found on the floor of Mark I's observatory, after freeing it from a notable proportion of the element radium.
That is so,
replied Cantrell, the zoologist. That is so, replied Warham, the botanist. Well, all I can say is that I, Peterson, tell you that we are looking at immature living specimens of upper and lower Cambrian flora and fauna. This lamellibranch is Lingulella, indistinguishable from the specimens found in the Lingula flags of Dolgelly. But this is fully represented by a living species. Similarly, these microorganisms are the same foraminifera as have been identified by Chapman in the upper Cambrian beds of Malvern, Lagina, Nodosauria, Crystalleria, Spirulina, but these genera are represented almost unaltered in modern seas. If it went no farther, I should be inclined to revert to the practical joke theory. But, and he paused for a moment before he went on, here are juvenile trilobites, paradoxides, agnosticeo. Here burrowing in the mud is the worm Histioderma. Here is the alga oldahemia of Edward Forbes. In any other circumstances, I should say that my brain was affected. But if I know anything at all of Cambrian paleontology, this minute thing swimming about in practically boiling water is the phyllopod crustacean, the shrimp Hymenoceraus. He stopped abruptly, and in the dead silence which followed, we all looked at one another, and from one another to the tanks and the slides which lay strewn about the microscope. Cantrell was the first to speak.
Then you think, said he, that the material under examination is...
I don't think, replied Peterson explosively. I can't think. I dare not think. But if I allowed myself to think anything, I think the material is cosmic dust. Cosmic dust? Moved by one impulse, we all leapt to our feet and crowded once more together at the laboratory bench. But none of us said a word. All our minds, I undertake to swear, reverted on the spot to a memorable meeting of the Geological Society, at which Professor Peterson had risen to his greatest height, pulverizing the planetesimal theory of Svante Arrhenius. The whole frantic and interminable controversy between the mechanists and the vitalists, almost the dead issue between the catastrophists and the uniformitarians, sprang into our thoughts. That Peterson of all men in the world, should admit the introduction into a scientific discussion, though he had done practically all the talking, as usual, of the mere phrase cosmic dust. It was as if Cantrell had suddenly taken up his parable in defense of the discredited Bathybius. We will not carry the matter further now, said Peterson, in his best lecture theater manner. I will look in from time to time and watch the development of these observations. You will all of you please meet in my room after 4 this day week. And with that, he left us,
Squid Game.
Leaving the door open.
Oh, he's excited.
True to his word, Peterson haunted the botanical laboratory all that week. And obedient to his summons, we met in his room on the appointed day. We sat round like good little first-year students whilst he lectured us. I will not go back to the theory of Nordenskjöld that by the fall of meteorites and cosmic dust the weight of the Earth is annually increased by at least 10 million tons. I shall advance no new theory of my own. I have here Svante Arrhenius's book, Worlds in the Making. I will merely refer to some passages which I marked for criticism on an occasion which you doubtless all remember. We shared between us the flicker of a faint smile, which seemed to accentuate the portentous gravity of Peterson. I have heard incomplete accounts of the phenomena alleged to have taken place prior to the death of Marquand. I have supposed, pardonably, that Chalmers was temporarily insane. I have reconsidered that opinion. The presence, the person, if you will, which he has recorded, apparently arrived upon this planet from Venus by radiation pressure. The mean temperature of Venus has been calculated at 40 degrees centigrade, a temperature clearly favorable to organic life. The same may be said of Mars, but this time required for particles to reach here from Venus
40 days as calculated by Arrhenius is clearly open to revision. Upon the theory of the organic nature of these particles much has been written. The theory of panspermia, suggested by de Montlivaud, by Richter, by Flammarion, others. I have come to look with respect upon Kelvin's remarkable views on this subject, expressed in his presidential address before the British Association in 1871. I will read you Arrhenius's statement of the theory, which is as follows. It is probable that there are organisms so small that the radiation pressure of a sun would push them out into space, where they might give rise to life on planets, provided they met with favorable conditions for their development. I recall your minds to the culture processes you have severally adopted. He continued to read extracts from the work of Arrhenius. Who shall say that such germs are not continually being carried away from this earth? Most of these spores thus carried away will no doubt meet death in the cold infinite space of the universe, about -220 degrees Celsius. Yet a small number of spores will fall upon some other world, and may thus be able to spread life if the conditions are suitable. You will remember that at the Jenner Institute in London, microorganisms have lived for 24 hours in liquid hydrogen at a temperature of 252 degrees Celsius. It may take 1 million or several millions of years from the age at which a planet could possibly begin to sustain life to the time when the first seed falls upon it and germinates, and when organic life is thus originated. This period is of little significance in comparison with the time during which life will afterwards flourish on this planet. It may be objected that the powerful light from the sun during the transit would kill these germs. The experiments of Roux have shown us that spores that are readily killed by light when the air has access remain alive when the air is excluded. No one can assert with certainty that spores would be killed by the light rays in wandering through infinite space. The germs are propelled by the radiation pressure, attached to grains of dust which serve both as carriers and protectors. Why have the experiments you have made not been made before? Arrhenius terminates his book with the answer. The number of germs which reach us from other worlds will be extremely limited. Not more, perhaps, than a few within a year all over the Earth's surface. The dust precipitated in Mark I's observatory was a concentrated precipitation. Nothing like it has ever been suggested, much less demonstrated before. Therefore, gentlemen, I am of the opinion, and I express it with a full sense of the responsibility which I incur in expressing it, that the material under consideration is cosmic dust, similar to those which was falling in Cambrian times, 1,000 million years ago, which germinated when the conditions became favorable and produced the Cambrian fauna and flora, exactly as you have produced them in Warham's laboratory. Peterson sat down and dried his forehead with his handkerchief. I was the first to break the silence, and my voice was husky. What shall we do about it? Publish? No! 1,000 times no, cried Peterson. What is the use? We should be laughed to scorn in every scientific society of the world. We should go down to posterity as hoaxed or mad. There is only one thing to be done. We must destroy all traces of the cultures, and we must hold our tongues. And upon that, we parted. End of section 8. Section 9 of The Purple Sapphire and Other Posthumous Papers by Christopher Blayre. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Cheetah Girl, Part 1. Deposited by the Professor of Physiology in the University of Cosmopolis. Note of explanation. The note by my publishers on page 211 requires an explanation which circumstances rendered it both difficult and desirable to offer in that place. The 7 published manuscripts were selected by me from among a large number of which I have become custodian, as explained in my anti-script to the Purple Saphire, and at the same time I brought away with me from the safe in the university library for perusal the manuscript of the Cheetah Girl. This manuscript, though setting forth the principles of an inquiry and experiments in a branch of biological research, the importance of which it would be impossible to overestimate, contains matters of record of such a nature that it could not possibly be published in a volume destined for public circulation. The table of contents was, however, compiled from the title covers of the manuscripts by my secretary, who, I may mention parenthetically, made the mistake of writing, deposited by the professor of biology instead of physiology. There is no chair of general biology in the University of Cosmopoli. This table went to the printers after my departure from England on a protracted holiday, and was set up with the rest of what is technically called the preliminary matter. When, on my return, my publishers asked for this manuscript, I considered that I was justified in showing it to them in confidence, and they at once agreed with me that it could not be printed. Hence, the note, which reviewers have regarded some in the light of a joke, and some as a touch of intentional sensationalism. Christopher Blayre. The Cheetah Girl. I have spent a long and very tiring day in London, and I have come home, worn out physically and mentally. But I have settled all my worldly affairs and am, I think, prepared for any eventuality. I am now ready, therefore, to kill my wife on the first opportunity that offers. I have written that deliberately, so as to see and to realize how terrible it looks. Written down to stiffen myself, so to speak, for, if it be possible, I admire my wife even more today than I did when we set out upon our wonderful honeymoon, just over 3 months ago. But, terrible as it is to contemplate, she must die as soon as possible. The welfare of the race demands her death. There is bound to be an inquest, and I dread even now what the post-mortem examination of her beautiful body may reveal. The manner of her death I have thought out and decided upon, and there is not, I believe, the slightest possibility of my being connected in the remotest degree with the tragedy. But I have deemed it expedient to make such arrangements as regards my affairs as may become necessary in the event of my being hung for murder. For I should not offer any defense or explanation of my act. I owe that to her mother, to my predecessor in the chair of physiology in the university, and to the memory of 3 months of the most passionate happiness which have ever fallen to the lot of man. And even if I did explain my action, would my explanation be believed? Perhaps it might. In the light of proofs I could bring forward, but would life be possible for me among human beings afterwards? 1,000 times no. But I owe it to science to record the circumstances which have led to the step I am henceforth seeking the opportunity to take. I shall deposit this record with the registrar of the university, with precautions that it shall not be read until many years have elapsed after my death. I have no near relations, and I shall not marry again. Therefore, no one living can be hurt. And, in any case, the facts I have to record, whilst of paramount importance to the physiologists and the future, can never be given any wide publicity. If, indeed, they can be imparted to anyone at all, excepting under the seat of professional secrecy. Thus much by way of introduction. My record must commence with the year 19 blank, when, having taken my degrees of Doctor of Medicine and Doctor of Science, I was appointed assistant and demonstrator to Professor Paul Barrowdale, FRS, Professor of Psychology in the University of Cosmopoli. With our academic duties, I am not concerned now, and the records, so far as they could be published of the research work done in the laboratory of that daring and brilliant physiologist, are to be found scattered among pages of the contemporary journals of science. It is with our personal relations that I am constrained to deal. These became, almost from their inception, of the most intimate nature. In our work in the university, I recognized in him a brilliant master. He recognized in me a devoted and assiduous pupil. Outside our professional connection, our tastes, our views were strangely identical. He was no narrow-minded or ascetic scientist, and away from the university, his appreciation of the pleasures of life, of wine, women, and song, of travel, literature, and art, found a ready response in me. and we became confidential friends and companions to a degree which is very rare between a professor and his assistant. There was only one subject upon which he never touched, even in our moments of closest intimacy and confidence, and in regard to which I never attempted to break the seal of silence which he had imposed upon himself and tacitly upon me. This subject was Mrs. Clayton. As regards this lady, though the gossip which is indigenous to a university town no doubt from time to time formulated theories, for Barrowdale was a free-living bachelor, was, as such, looked askant upon by many of the professorial staff and their wives. No one would ever come out in the open, so to speak, for the all-sufficient reason that any scandal openly promulgated would have to be rapidly sterilized, should Barrowdale have shown any signs of wanting to marry any daughter of the university, and much will be tacitly ignored in a bachelor professor of more than ample private means. Mrs. Clayton lived in a charming little house about 3 miles out of the town. It was understood that Barrowdale was her trustee, and had charge of her business affairs. There was a child, a girl, whom no one ever saw, but whether the child was born after Mrs. Clayton's arrival in the neighborhood, or before that event, no one was in a position to say. One academic lady, with daughters, had gone so far as to ascertain that the child, whose curious name was Unica, was not registered at birth in the district registry. Beyond this, nothing was known. Barrowdale never afforded any intelligence, and if, as was whispered from time to time with bated breath, à quatre yeux, she was his daughter, there was nothing on record to convey the slightest indication or a priori evidence of the fact. I saw her once. I was walking with Barrowdale, and we met Mrs. Clayton and the child, an ugly, sallow, swarthy little thing, who struck me as singularly repellent and uninteresting. Mrs. Clayton was a nervous, faded person, gentle in manner and appearance, but quite unnoticeable. She went nowhere and knew no one. Neither mother nor daughter interested me in the least. Now and then I believed an undergraduate would refer contemptuously to old Barrowdale's woman, but there was no talk in the university sense of the word. Several years passed by during which our work in the laboratory and schools and our pleasures in companionship grew more and more intimately connected, so much so that I refused the offer of a professorship in a northern university rather than be separated from Barrowdale, for the work we were engaged upon was of the highest physiological importance. He was grateful to me for this, and I know that he never lost an opportunity of impressing upon the authorities that I was his natural and indicated successor in the chair of physiology on his death or retirement. This came about one day with appalling suddenness. Barrowdale had been seedy, nervy, off-color for several days. He had been out more than once to see Mrs. Clayton, as I knew, and one evening came home tired to death and drenched to the skin. The next day he was in a high fever. In the evening, septic pneumonia of a most virulent type set in, and in 24 hours, he was dead. I found that he had made me, together with his solicitor, a worthy old man in London, his executor and trustee. He provided an annuity of £600 a year for Mrs. Clayton, which on her death devolved to Unica. The rest of his property, he being apparently alone in the world, was bequeathed to the university. The good woman, who seemed absolutely paralyzed by the death of Barrowdale, came into Cosmopolis to see me whenever her affairs required an interview, always the same nervous, uninteresting creature. I confessed I hoped she would be led on some occasion to speak of Unica's father, but in spite of one or two leads, she never followed, and being really quite uninterested in the matter, I never tried to press the subject. In due course, almost mechanically, I succeeded Barrowdale in the chair of physiology, and I had neither time nor inclination to concern myself about my two sestures que trusten. We come then by effluxion of time to the end of last term. The men were due to go down for the long vacation next day, and I had made all arrangements for a protracted tour down the Loire and through the Midi of France. I may mention that Barrowdale left me by his will the comfortable and comforting legacy of £10,000. Some paper came to me on this memorable day from my co-trustee, connected with a change of investment, which required Mrs. Clayton's signature. There was no time to communicate by post, so I jumped into my two-seater and ran out to her house. I rang the bell and the door was opened by the most beautiful being that I had ever seen in my life, and I'd seen a good many. "Mrs. Clayton?" I began. "Mother is out," she replied. "You are Professor Magley? Please come in." She held out her hand, which I took, and without letting go of mine, she drew me into their sitting room, a cozy little place furnished with great taste, Barrowdale's taste, and strewn with fur rugs which gave off a warm, sensuous perfume. The touch of the girl's hand was electrical. It sent a thrill of intense desire up my arm to my brain, and when she dropped my hand and stood before me, her lips parted in a smile more provoking than anything of the kind I had ever seen. I was simply struck dumb, and stood looking at her, my heart beating violently. She was a lithe creature of rather more than average stature, draped rather than dressed in a kind of dull red silk wrapper, confined at the waist by a suede leather belt. It folded across her breasts, one of which, perfect in form, almost escaped from the folds, and came down to just below her knees. Her legs were bare, and her feet were shod in fur-lined slippers. I verily believed that, save for this garment, she was naked. Her face was indescribable, a mass of purple-black hair gathered into a loose bunch on the top of her head, thick dark eyebrows shadowing long lazy eyes, which seemed to me to be enormous, her complexion a tawny russet brown, with a suspicion of down on the cheeks, and more than a suspicion of it at the corners of her upper lip. She had let her hands fall by her sides, and as she looked at me with that marvelous smile, the tip of a crimson tongue passed slowly across her lower lip from one side to the other. I was struck, even at that wonderful moment, by the comparative prominence of her little canine teeth, which gave an indescribable and characteristic charm to her smile. Without saying a word, and, I declare, without any conscious volition of my own, I held out my arms, and she stepped forward into them. I crushed her body to me, and our lips joined. I thought until then that I knew what it was to be kissed. I did not. The lingering passion of Unica's kiss was unlike anything I had ever dreamed of as possible. Her tongue, which sought mine, was strangely long and firm, and even in the delirium of the moment, it seemed to me that her lingual papillae were accentuated almost to the point of roughness, but the exquisite power of it defies words. Her arms were round me, her legs were twisted into mine, and I think I should have fallen had she not gently disengaged herself, and, still holding me by one arm, she drew me towards a low divan covered with fine skins, from which I had evidently aroused her. As she reached it, she flung herself down upon the skins, and as she fell, one beautifully modeled leg, bare to mid-thigh, escaped from the folds of her wrapper. She raised her arms to me in a gesture of divine invitation, and at that moment the door opened and Mrs. Clayton came in. I do not know what was to be read from my face as I turned towards her, but if it was a reflection of Unica's, Mrs. Clayton must have been blind indeed if she did not take in the situation at a glance. I began very haltingly to utter apologies and to explain my visit. She was obviously very much upset and distressed, but all she said was, in short, disjointed sentences, I see. I could not have expected. No one comes here. I should not have gone out. I never do. Please bring the papers in here." And she led me into the dining room, where there were pens and so on. All this time Unica had not moved or uttered a sound, but just lay curled up luxuriously on the divan, watching me with her huge eyes, and, as it were, swaying her beautiful smile from side to side. I cannot describe it otherwise. The slipper had fallen from the foot of the leg which still lay unconcernedly outside her sarong, and here was the only movement that she made. The toes opened and shut and curled inwards towards the palm of her foot, with a regulated movement which seemed to me to be indicative of extreme and perfect luxury. Mrs. Clayton signed the papers, with a shaky hand, it is true, but said nothing about Unica. The silence becoming oppressive, I thought it obvious and tactful to say, "Your daughter has grown into a very striking young woman." "Yes, very," replied the poor woman nervously. "Very. I never leave her if I can help it, but expecting no one, I went in next door for something. The servant is out. And so..." She tailed off incoherently, and I saw that I was distressing her, so I took my leave as casually as I could, with my blood boiling in my veins and my heart throbbing. When I got outside, I took a deep breath, but I seemed saturated with the tense, sensuous perfume of Unica's room and of Unica herself, for, whether it was contact with her divan or what, her whole body gave off a perfume for which there was only one word. It was intoxicating. Slightly savage. It clung to me all the way back to my rooms, and even afterwards when I'd opened all the windows. I need hardly say that I could not get her out of my thoughts all day, nor did I want to. Then I dreamed a dream. Next morning, as I went on with my packing and the college was rapidly emptying of the men off on long vacation, I said to myself, "Look here, my son. You are that girl's guardian. Barrowdale has entrusted her to you. It's a damned good thing that you are off tomorrow for 3 months, and when you get back again, keep clear of it." Thus I apostrophized myself, and knew that I wanted Unica more than anything else in the world. By the afternoon, the college was practically empty, and I had finished my packing and was trying to read an abstruse German treatise on cytology.
That's surprising.
But I couldn't. My senses were on edge, unnaturally keen. Hypertrophied, as it were. I heard a step in the quad. It slithered up my stair. A rap on the door. I knew who it was before the door was flung open. In an instant, we were in one another's arms. The long witchery of her kiss, the invitation of her magical tongue. Everything was my dream come true. I had in my rooms a divan no less vivid with willing complicity than the one at the cottage. We fell upon it without a word. And, in spite of the fact that Unica was in a physical condition in which it is customary for young women to withhold themselves from active caress, we gave ourselves up to one another naturally, unthinkingly, in a whirlwind orgy of exquisite possession and ecstasy. Presently, when we were able to talk, for until then not a word had been uttered on either side, I asked her how she had got away.
"Mother's had a sleepless night," she said. "And this afternoon she locked the front and back doors and went to bed. I got out of the window. I wanted you so frightfully."
An hour passed in a delirium of sensuous delight which cannot be hinted at, not from motives of reticence, for I am determined to record here the absolute facts as they occurred, without any periphrasis, but because the marvel that was Unica simply beggars and defies description. I thought I had known passion. Fool! I'd never even touched its fringe. If Unica was wonderful to behold in her dull red sarong, what was she naked? No painter or sculptor ever imagined, much less reproduced so perfect a body. Her beautiful breasts stood out in perfect proportion, the nipples prominent and surrounded with a silky aureole of tiny purple curls, tender and fascinating. Her auxiliary hair was phenomenally thick, and I speedily found that to be kissed and petted under her arms drove her frantic with delight. I have had reason to remember and be thankful for this, as will be seen later. The whole of her body was covered with the light soft down such as is seen upon many fair women, but upon Unica it was deeper in shade than usual, and it was punctuated here and there with little streaks, and sometimes almost circles of a still deeper tone. From her navel downwards it increased into a glorious mass of pubic hair, which extended from hip to hip, and though so dense was of the most amazingly soft texture, covering the whole of the lower stomach and intercrural space with a veritable fourrure. It was wonderful, and, to repeat the only adjective which describes any of Unica's esoteric attributes, intoxicating. Her forearms and legs were deliciously hirsute, and even up and down her spine a narrow furry band invited one's most ingenious caresses. Whoever gave her the name of Unica knew what he was about, prophetically. We were lying in one another's arms, whispering passionate secrets to one another, I in a silk bathrobe and she clad only in her wonderful skin and hair, when the door, which we had never thought of locking, was flung open, and Mrs. Clayton stood before us, frankly petrified and aghast. I sprang to my feet and burst into words. "Do not misjudge us," I cried. We love one another as I never dreamed it possible to love. We shall be married at once. I will get a license tomorrow, and next day Unica will be my wife. Forgive us the passion that has made us irresistible to one another. You will understand, I am sure. You are a woman who has loved, and you are her mother. Now you will have a devoted son as well as a daughter. I paused. Mrs. Clayton had not said a word. She had fallen into a chair, and, ashy white, looked back and forth from me to Unica, who, utterly unconscious of her exquisite nakedness, lay on the divan looking at us, with the same wonderful smile that had overwhelmed and held me, her crimson tongue passing to and fro across her lower lip. Then Mrs. Clayton got up, apparently with an effort, and she said, No. It cannot. It can never be. You don't know. Oh, I am a wicked woman. At these times she is not responsible for what she does. And besides, she knows nothing. I never let her out of my sight until the danger is over. Let me take her away. But, my dear lady, I said, reflect a moment. We must be married now. We are both, I comparatively, young, and for a university professor, I am rich. I will be the best of husbands to her, the best of sons to you. Our old friend Barrowdale would have wished it, I am sure. I was his favorite, his only intimate friend. At Barrowdale's name, the poor woman started as if she had been stung. No, she cried again. He would not. He would have killed himself and her, rather. It has all been so sudden. I have not had time. Forgive me, for God's sake, and let me take her away. Well then, let us be engaged for a short while, I said ineptly. No, never. She must never marry. She can't. Oh, don't torture me. There was no reasoning with her. She was like a madwoman. Unica stood up in all her glorious statuesque nudity and allowed her mother to dress her with shaking hands, whilst I looked on. I cut a poor figure. When she was dressed, Mrs. Clayton took her away. She went without casting a look in my direction. I was simply stunned. I can give no description of the phantasmagoria of my thoughts for the rest of the afternoon and evening. One thing was certain. I could not leave England without having this matter cleared up and placed upon a proper, the only possible, basis. I thought and thought. What mad idea could the woman have? I tried to reason it out. I racked my brains for an explanation, but found none. The girl was alive with passion. She was predestined to fall into the hands of some casual sensualist. What better solution, if her passion was in part or in any way pathological, than to give her to a husband who would look after her? I wearied myself with thoughts and tumbled into bed at midnight. At 3 a.m., I was awakened by a rapping at my door. I started into vivid wakefulness. It could only be Unica.
It could only be Unica. I'm pretty satisfied with this. It's pretty good. Talk about Mrs. Clayton. I have no clue what you're talking about. Don't talk about it. You. Take a fiver, though. A good moment to take a break. We may start